The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Maria Santos walked through the security checkpoint. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore simple civilian clothes that gave no hint of her extraordinary past. The security guard barely glanced at her identification card as she passed through, just another contractor arriving for another ordinary day. Maria had been working as a translator for the past 3 months at Naval Station Norfolk, helping with communications between American forces and allied nations. Her job was quiet, behind-the-scenes work that suited her perfectly. She preferred to remain unnoticed, to blend into the background where painful memories couldn't find her. But today would be different. Today, everything would change. The trouble began when Maria arrived at Building 47, where she usually worked in the communications department. Instead of the familiar faces of her colleagues, she found the building surrounded by military police vehicles. Red and blue lights flashed against the gray concrete walls, creating an ominous atmosphere that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Excuse me, ma'am," called out a young MP as Maria approached the entrance. "This building is restricted. No one goes in or out." Maria showed her identification badge. "I work here. I'm a translator in the communications office." The MP studied her badge carefully, then radioed his supervisor. Maria waited, growing more confused by the minute. Other employees were gathering outside the building, all looking equally puzzled and concerned. Whispers spread through the crowd about a security breach, possible espionage, and classified information that had gone missing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," the MP said, his voice formal and cold. "Is there a problem?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Maria replied, her accent becoming slightly more pronounced as stress crept into her voice. "Just routine questioning, ma'am. Please follow me." Maria was escorted to a small office building where several other employees were already waiting. The atmosphere was tense, filled with worried conversations and nervous glances. She recognized most of the faces, fellow translators, communication specialists, and administrative staff who had access to sensitive information. Hours passed as investigators questioned employees one by one. Maria watched as her colleagues were called in and out of interrogation rooms. Some emerged looking relieved, others appeared shaken. The waiting was excruciating, and Maria found herself thinking about her past, about things she had tried so hard to forget. When her turn finally came, Maria was led into a sterile interview room where 2 serious-looking investigators sat across from a metal table. Agent Thompson, a tall man with graying hair, introduced himself and his partner, Agent Martinez. Their questions started simply enough: her name, her position, how long she had been working at the base. "Where were you born, Miss Santos?" Agent Thompson asked, consulting a thick file. "Colombia," Maria answered truthfully. "And when did you come to the United States?" Maria hesitated for a moment. This was always the difficult part. 15 years ago. Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Under what circumstances?" The room fell silent as Maria considered her answer. She had hoped never to discuss this part of her life again, but she knew she had to be honest. "I was granted asylum." The agents exchanged glances. Agent Thompson opened the file wider, revealing documents and photographs that Maria recognized from her asylum case. "It says here you were a former member of the Colombian military. Specifically, you served in special operations." Maria nodded slowly. "That's correct. And you claim you were persecuted by your own government after reporting war crimes." "I don't claim it," Maria said firmly. "It happened." The questioning continued for another hour, covering details of her military service, her escape from Colombia, and her years in the United States. Maria answered every question truthfully, but she could feel the suspicion in the room growing thicker with each response. "Ms. Santos," Agent Martinez said finally, "we have reason to believe that someone with access to classified communications has been passing information to foreign contacts. Given your background and your position here, you understand why we need to be thorough." Maria felt her heart sink. She had worked so hard to build a new life, to escape the shadows of her past. Now those shadows were threatening to destroy everything she had built. "I have never betrayed the United States," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This country gave me sanctuary when my own wanted me dead. I would never do anything to harm it. But Her words seemed to carry little weight with the investigators. As the interview concluded, Maria was told she would need to remain available for further questioning. She was escorted back to the waiting area, where she noticed that fewer people remained. Most of her colleagues had been cleared and allowed to leave. The next morning brought worse news. Maria arrived at the base to find that her security clearance had been suspended pending a full investigation. She was barred from entering any classified areas and was assigned to temporary clerical work in a different building. The demotion was humiliating, and she could feel the stares and whispers of other employees as word spread about her situation. Days turned into weeks as the investigation dragged on. Maria's life became a nightmare of constant scrutiny. Her apartment was searched twice. Her phone records were examined. Her few friends and acquaintances were questioned about her activities and loyalties. She felt like she was living under a microscope, every action analyzed for signs of guilt. The worst part was the isolation. Colleagues who had once been friendly now avoided her, afraid of being associated with someone under investigation for espionage. Maria ate lunch alone, worked alone, and went home to an empty apartment where she lay awake at night wondering if her new life in America was about to crumble. 3 weeks into the investigation, Maria was called back for another round of questioning. This time, the atmosphere was even more hostile. Agent Thompson slammed a folder on the table in front of her, scattering photographs and documents. "We know about your contacts in Colombia," he said accusingly. Maria looked at the photographs and recognized her sister Elena and her nephew Carlos. The pictures appeared to have been taken recently, showing them going about their daily lives in Bogotá. "That's my family," Maria said quietly. "Family that still lives in a country where you have enemies," Agent Martinez pointed out. "Family that could be used to pressure you into cooperating with hostile forces." "My sister is a teacher, and my nephew is 12 years old," Maria protested. "They have nothing to do with politics or the military." "But they could be leverage," Thompson insisted. "Someone could threaten them to force you to cooperate." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The investigators were right about one thing. Her family's safety had always been a concern. The people she had exposed for war crimes still had power in Colombia. If they knew where she was, if they wanted to reach her. "Have they been threatened?" Maria asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "We don't know," Martinez admitted. "But the possibility exists." The interview continued with increasingly aggressive questions about her communications, her activities outside of work, and her knowledge of other employees who had access to classified information. Maria answered everything truthfully, but she could see that her honesty was being interpreted as evasion. As the weeks passed, Maria's situation grew more desperate. Her temporary work assignment was mindless data entry that paid barely enough to cover her expenses. She was falling behind on rent and struggling to afford groceries. The stress was affecting her health. She lost weight, developed insomnia, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. The investigation seemed to be going nowhere. No evidence of espionage had been found, but no evidence of her innocence had emerged either. Maria existed in a gray area of suspicion, unable to clear her name, but not formally charged with any crime. One evening, as Maria sat in her nearly empty apartment eating a dinner of rice and beans, she made a decision that would change everything. She rolled up the sleeve of her shirt and looked at the tattoo on her left forearm, a small eagle with outstretched wings, surrounded by Spanish words that few Americans would understand. The tattoo was a reminder of her past, of things she had tried to forget. But it was also proof of who she really was and what she had sacrificed. Maria had kept it hidden for 15 years, afraid that it would raise questions she didn't want to answer. Now, with her life falling apart, she wondered if the time had come to reveal its meaning. The next day at work, Maria made an unusual decision. Instead of wearing her usual long-sleeved blouse, she chose a short-sleeved shirt that left her forearm exposed. The tattoo, which she had kept hidden for so long, was now visible to anyone who cared to look. Most people didn't notice or didn't care about the small tattoo. But as Maria worked at her computer, she felt eyes on her. When she looked up, she saw a janitor staring at her arm with an expression of shock and recognition. The man was older, probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and calloused hands. He wore the simple uniform of base maintenance staff, someone who was essentially invisible to most military personnel. But his eyes held an intelligence and awareness that suggested there was more to him than his humble job implied. "Excuse me, miss," the janitor said quietly, approaching her desk. "That tattoo on your arm, where did you get it?" Maria's instinct was to cover the tattoo and deflect the question, as she had done countless times before. But something in the man's voice, a note of respect and curiosity rather than suspicion, made her pause. "It's from my military service," she said simply. The janitor nodded slowly. "Colombian Special Forces," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. Very few people could identify the specific unit insignia, especially not someone who appeared to be a simple maintenance worker on an American naval base. "How did you?" she began, but the janitor had already moved on, pushing his cart to the next office. Maria spent the rest of the day thinking about the encounter. There had been something in the man's eyes, a recognition that went beyond simple curiosity. As she prepared to leave work, she found herself looking for him in the hallways, but he was nowhere to be seen. That night, Maria's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but when she answered, she heard Agent Thompson's voice. "Miss Santos, we need you to come in tomorrow morning for another interview." "What's this about?" Maria asked, though she suspected she knew. "We've received new information about your case. Be at the Federal Building at 9 a.m. sharp." Maria barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. Had they found evidence against her? Was she about to be arrested? Or had something changed in her favor? The next morning, Maria arrived at the Federal Building with a sense of dread. She was escorted to the same interview room where she had spent so many uncomfortable hours, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Agents Thompson and Martinez were there, but they were accompanied by a third person, a military officer in naval uniform whose rank insignia identified him as an admiral. Admiral James Harrison was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. His chest was decorated with ribbons that spoke of a long and distinguished career. When he looked at Maria, his expression was unreadable. "Ms. Santos," Agent Thompson began, "this is Admiral Harrison. He's requested to observe this interview." Maria nodded politely, unsure of what this development meant for her case. "Before we begin," Admiral Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "I'd like to ask you to roll up your left sleeve." Maria felt her heart skip a beat. The tattoo. Somehow, this was about the tattoo. With trembling fingers, Maria rolled up her sleeve, exposing the small eagle and Spanish words that had remained hidden for so long. Admiral Harrison studied the tattoo carefully, his expression changing from neutral observation to something that looked like recognition and respect. "Agent Thompson," the Admiral said finally, "I believe you owe Ms. Santos an apology." The tension in the interview room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Agent Thompson looked confused, glancing between Admiral Harrison and Maria's exposed tattoo. Agent Martinez leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the small eagle design on Maria's forearm. "Admiral, I don't understand," Thompson said, his voice uncertain for the first time since Maria had met him. Admiral Harrison stood up, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "That tattoo," Agent Thompson, identifies Ms. Santos as a member of the Aguilas Negras, the Black Eagles. They were an elite Colombian Special Forces unit that worked closely with American military advisors during some very difficult operations in the 1990s and early 2000s. Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never expected anyone to recognize the significance of her tattoo, especially not an American admiral. The Black Eagles had been a classified unit, their existence known only to a select few in both the Colombian and American militaries. "I still don't see how this changes anything," Agent Martinez interjected. "Her military background is already part of our investigation." Admiral Harrison turned to face the agents directly. "What's not in your files, gentlemen, is that Ms. Santos didn't just serve in the Black Eagles. She was instrumental in exposing a massive corruption scandal that reached the highest levels of the Colombian military and government. Her intelligence led to the arrest of dozens of corrupt officials and saved countless American lives." The room fell silent. Maria stared at the Admiral, wondering how he could possibly know details that were buried in classified files. The Black Eagles operation had been so secret that most of the American personnel involved didn't even know the real names of their Colombian counterparts. In 2008, Admiral Harrison continued. Ms. Santos discovered that high-ranking officers in her unit were selling weapons to drug cartels and sharing intelligence about American operations. When she tried to report this through official channels, she was threatened with court-martial and execution for treason. Maria remembered those dark days all too well. The fear, the isolation, the knowledge that powerful people wanted her dead. She had spent months gathering evidence, documenting the corruption, knowing that her life hung in the balance with every piece of information she uncovered. She managed to contact American intelligence through a back channel. The Admiral went on. The information she provided led to Operation Clean Sweep, which dismantled one of the most dangerous military cartel partnerships in Colombian history. Agent Thompson looked skeptical. Admiral, with all due respect, if this is true, why isn't any of this in her file? Why doesn't she have some kind of official recognition or protection status? Admiral Harrison smiled grimly. Because, Agent Thompson, the operation was so sensitive that all records were classified beyond top secret. Ms. Santos was given a new identity and quietly relocated to the United States. Her asylum case was processed through special channels to protect both her identity and the operational details. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes. For 15 years, she had carried the burden of her past alone, unable to tell anyone the full truth about why she had fled Colombia. She had been branded a traitor by some and forgotten by others, living in the shadows of her former life. The janitor, Maria said suddenly, the pieces falling into place. Yesterday, a janitor recognized my tattoo. He knew what unit I served in. Admiral Harrison nodded. Master Chief Petty Officer Roberto Vega, retired. He was my liaison officer during the Black Eagles operations. He contacted me immediately after seeing your tattoo and recognizing who you were. The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Master Chief Vega had been one of the American advisors she had worked with during her time in Special Forces. She remembered him as a competent, professional soldier who had treated the Colombian operatives with respect and dignity. To think that he had been working as a janitor on the same base where she was employed seemed like an impossible coincidence. Roberto has been keeping an eye on you since you started working here, Admiral Harrison explained. When he learned about the investigation, he was concerned that your true background wasn't being taken into account. Agent Martinez was taking notes furiously. Admiral, assuming all of this is true, it still doesn't eliminate the possibility that Ms. Santos could be compromised now. Foreign intelligence services are very sophisticated in their recruitment methods. You're absolutely right, Admiral Harrison agreed. Which is why I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing every aspect of her case with intelligence professionals who were involved in the original operation. The Admiral reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with classification stamps. What I'm about to share with you is being declassified specifically for this investigation. Ms. Santos, you should know that you've been under protective surveillance since you arrived in the United States. Maria felt the world spinning around her. Protective surveillance. The people you exposed in Colombia didn't just disappear, Admiral Harrison explained. Several of them are still alive, still powerful, and still very interested in settling old scores. The CIA has been monitoring potential threats against you for 15 years. He opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table. The images showed men in expensive suits, some getting into luxury cars, others meeting in upscale restaurants. Maria recognized several faces, former colleagues who had been involved in the corruption she had exposed. 3 months ago, the Admiral continued, we intercepted communications suggesting that your location had been discovered. The same week, a security breach occurred at this naval facility. The timing was not coincidental. Agent Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression changing as he processed this new information. You're saying someone was trying to frame her? I'm saying someone was trying to eliminate her, Admiral Harrison replied bluntly. What better way to destroy a protected witness than to have her arrested as a spy and sent back to Colombia, where she would face certain death? Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The investigation that had made her life miserable for the past month hadn't been about national security at all. It had been an assassination attempt disguised as law enforcement. But how could they have orchestrated the security breach? Agent Martinez asked. That would require inside knowledge of base operations. Admiral Harrison nodded grimly. Which brings us to the real traitor. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Chun, who worked in the same communications office as Ms. Santos. Chun has gambling debts that made him vulnerable to recruitment by foreign agents. He was passing classified information to Colombian contacts in exchange for money to pay off his debts. The agents exchanged glances. Chun was a quiet, unremarkable sailor who had worked in communications for 2 years. Maria barely knew him beyond polite greetings in the hallway. Chun's handlers became aware that Ms. Santos was working in the same office, the Admiral explained. They saw an opportunity to eliminate a long-standing threat while deflecting suspicion from their actual asset. Chun was instructed to plant evidence that would implicate Ms. Santos in the security breach. What kind of evidence? Agent Thompson asked. Admiral Harrison pulled out another file. Forged email communications that appeared to show Ms. Santos in contact with Colombian intelligence services. The emails were created using sophisticated software and planted in the system to be discovered during the investigation. Maria shook her head in amazement. The conspiracy against her had been more elaborate than she could have imagined. Where is Chun now? In custody, Admiral Harrison replied. He was arrested 2 hours ago when he attempted to leave the country with $50,000 in cash and a false passport. Agent Martinez was still skeptical. Admiral, this is all very convenient. How do we know that Ms. Santos wasn't working with Chun? How do we know this isn't just a more sophisticated cover story? Admiral Harrison stood up and walked around the table to stand directly in front of Maria. Because, Agent Martinez, I know exactly who Maria Santos is and what she sacrificed for both our countries. He turned to address the room. In 2008, during her final mission with the Black Eagles, Ms. Santos was tasked with infiltrating a meeting between corrupt military officers and cartel leaders. The meeting was a trap. Her cover had been blown, and they knew she was gathering evidence against them. Maria closed her eyes, remembering that night. The warehouse outside Medellin. The realization that she had walked into an ambush. The sound of gunfire and the desperate fight for survival. She could have escaped, Admiral Harrison continued. But there were 3 American advisors at that meeting, my officers who had been betrayed by the same corrupt officials. Ms. Santos had a choice. Save herself or risk everything to save 3 Americans she barely knew. The room was completely silent now. Maria could hear her own heartbeat as the Admiral recounted the most difficult night of her life. She chose to fight her way back into that warehouse, he said, his voice filled with quiet respect. She killed 4 cartel sicarios and 2 corrupt soldiers to reach our people. She carried a wounded American officer on her back for 3 miles through hostile territory to reach an extraction point. Admiral Harrison paused, his eyes meeting Maria's. One of those officers was my son, Lieutenant James Harrison Jr. He's alive today because of Maria Santos. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Agent Thompson and Agent Martinez stared at the Admiral in stunned silence. Maria felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she remembered that young lieutenant, barely out of the Naval Academy, bleeding from a gunshot wound as she carried him through the jungle. Your son, Maria whispered. Captain James Harrison Jr., now commanding officer of the USS Wyoming. Admiral Harrison replied with obvious pride. He wanted to be here today, but he's currently deployed in the Pacific. The Admiral returned to his seat, his expression becoming formal again. Gentlemen, I think it's clear that Ms. Santos deserves better treatment than she's received. She's a hero who has been living under an assumed identity to protect both herself and classified operations. The suggestion that she would betray the country that gave her sanctuary is not just wrong, it's insulting. Agent Thompson was frantically making notes. Admiral, we'll need to coordinate with the CIA to verify all of this information and adjust our investigation accordingly. The coordination has already begun, Admiral Harrison replied. Director Walsh will be briefing your superiors this afternoon. Chin will be transferred to federal custody for prosecution under the Espionage Act. Agent Martinez closed his file folder. What about Ms. Santos? Does she need to remain under surveillance? The threat against her is real and ongoing, Admiral Harrison acknowledged. But her security arrangements will be handled by more appropriate agencies. Your investigation into her loyalty and activities can be officially closed. Maria felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had been carrying for weeks. The nightmare of suspicion and isolation was finally ending, but she realized that other challenges lay ahead. What happens now? She asked. Admiral Harrison considered the question carefully. That depends partly on what you want, Ms. Santos. Your cover identity has been maintained for 15 years, but recent events have compromised it to some degree. You have several options. He enumerated the possibilities. You can continue your current life with enhanced security measures. You can be relocated again with a new identity. Or, if you're willing, you can consider returning to more active service. Active service? The military has evolved since you left Colombia, Admiral Harrison explained. There are new opportunities for someone with your skills and experience. Special operations forces, intelligence analysis, training programs for allied forces. Your knowledge of South American military structures and cartel operations is valuable. Maria had never considered returning to military life. For 15 years, she had tried to put that part of her past behind her, to build a quiet, peaceful existence. But the events of recent weeks had shown her that her past would never truly leave her alone. I need time to think, she said. Of course, Admiral Harrison replied. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, you'll be returned to your regular duties with full clearance restored. Master Chief Vega has requested permission to make himself known to you officially, if you're interested in reconnecting with an old colleague. The interview concluded with apologies from both federal agents and assurances that Maria's record would be cleared of any implications of disloyalty. As she prepared to leave the federal building, Admiral Harrison asked to speak with her privately. Ms. Santos, he said when they were alone, I want you to understand something. What you did in Colombia, the sacrifices you made, they haven't been forgotten by everyone. There are people in both governments who remember and honor your service. I never expected recognition, Maria replied. I just did what I thought was right. Which is exactly why you deserve recognition, the Admiral said. Heroes rarely seek heroism. It finds them. As Maria walked out of the federal building into the bright afternoon sun, she felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't looking over her shoulder or wondering if people were talking about her. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over her life was finally lifting. But Admiral Harrison's words about active service kept echoing in her mind. Could she really go back to that life? Did she want to? After 15 years of hiding, the prospect of stepping back into the light was both exciting and terrifying. The next morning, Maria returned to Naval Station Norfolk with mixed emotions. Word of her exoneration had spread quickly through the communications office, and her colleagues greeted her with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Some approached to offer apologies for their cold treatment during the investigation, while others seemed unsure how to act around someone whose background had proven to be far more complex than anyone had imagined. Maria settled back into her regular workstation, grateful to be handling meaningful translations again instead of mindless data entry. But she found it difficult to concentrate on routine communications when her thoughts kept drifting to Admiral Harrison's offer and the possibilities it represented. During her lunch break, she decided to seek out Master Chief Vega. Finding him required some effort, as the maintenance staff worked throughout the sprawling base complex. She finally located him in Building 12, where he was repairing a broken air conditioning unit. When Roberto Vega saw her approaching, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile. He set down his tools and extended a hand in greeting. Ms. Santos, he said warmly. Or should I say, Lieutenant Santos? It's good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Please, just call me Maria, she replied, shaking his hand. I can't believe you've been here all this time. What are the chances? Roberto chuckled. Actually, the chances weren't that random. When I retired from active duty 5 years ago, I specifically requested to work here. I'd heard through unofficial channels that you were in the area, and I wanted to keep an eye on things. You've been watching over me? Maria asked, surprised. Not surveillance, Roberto clarified quickly. Just staying aware. Admiral Harrison wasn't the only one who remembered what you did for us. Several of us from the old Colombian operations have stayed in touch over the years. We made an informal pact to look out for you if any of us ever crossed paths with you again. Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest. For so many years, she had felt alone with her memories and her secrets. Learning that former American colleagues had remembered her and cared about her safety was deeply moving. I recognized your tattoo immediately, Roberto continued. But I had to be careful about how to approach the situation. Your cover identity was still active, and I didn't want to compromise you unnecessarily. Until the investigation started, Maria said. Exactly. When I learned you were being treated as a potential spy, I knew it was time to break protocol and contact Admiral Harrison. He was the highest-ranking officer still on active duty who could verify your true background. They talked for another 20 minutes, Roberto sharing stories about other members of their old unit and what had happened to various people after the Colombian operations ended. Many had scattered to different assignments around the world, but a few had maintained contact over the years. There's something else you should know, Roberto said as their conversation wound down. Admiral Harrison wasn't exaggerating about the ongoing threat against you. The intelligence community has been tracking several attempts over the years to locate former Black Eagles personnel. Maria felt her stomach tighten. How many attempts? At least 6 that we know of, Roberto replied grimly. 3 former Black Eagles have been killed in what appeared to be random crimes in different countries. But the pattern suggested professional hits designed to look like street violence. The news was sobering. Maria had always known that the people she had exposed might seek revenge, but she had hoped that 15 years would have diminished their interest in pursuing her. That's part of why Admiral Harrison is pushing for you to consider active service again, Roberto explained. In your current position, you're a civilian contractor with limited protection. If you were back in uniform, you'd have access to better security resources and a support network that could help keep you safe. As Maria walked back to her office, she pondered Roberto's words. The idea of returning to military service was becoming more appealing, but it would mean abandoning the quiet life she had built for herself. It would mean accepting that she could never truly escape her past. That evening, Maria's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number with a Colombian country code. Her heart raced as she debated whether to answer. Very few people had her current phone number, and legitimate calls from Colombia were extremely rare. Against her better judgment, she answered the call. Maria Santos, said a voice she recognized but had hoped never to hear again. It belonged to Colonel Rafael Mendoza, one of the corrupt officers she had helped expose 15 years earlier. Hello, Rafael, Maria replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I thought you might be interested to know that we've been following your recent troubles with American law enforcement, Mendoza said, his tone conversational but menacing. It must have been very stressful to be suspected of espionage. What do you want? Maria asked directly. The same thing I've wanted for 15 years, Mendoza replied. Justice for the damage you caused to patriots who were serving their country. Maria almost laughed at the characterization. Patriots who were selling weapons to drug cartels and getting American soldiers killed. Perspective is everything, Mendoza said coldly. What matters now is that we know where you are, and we know that your American protectors can't watch you every moment of every day. The line went dead. Maria stared at her phone, her hands trembling slightly. The call confirmed what Admiral Harrison and Roberto had been telling her. The threat against her was real and immediate. She immediately called the number Admiral Harrison had given her for emergencies. Within minutes, her apartment was surrounded by federal agents who swept the building for threats and installed additional security equipment. Ms. Santos, said Agent Patricia Wong from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, we intercepted that call to your phone. The person calling was indeed Colonel Rafael Mendoza, currently living in exile in Venezuela under government protection. So he can't touch me directly, Maria said, trying to feel reassured. He can't enter the United States legally, Agent Wong corrected. But he has resources and connections that extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. We're taking this threat very seriously. Over the next few days, Maria's life transformed again, but this time in the opposite direction from her recent troubles. Instead of being isolated and suspected, she was surrounded by protection and support. Federal agents escorted her to and from work. Her apartment building was under discreet surveillance. Her movements were tracked to ensure her safety. But Maria realized that this level of protection was not sustainable as a long-term solution. She couldn't live the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, dependent on others for her security. The phone call from Mendoza had crystallized something in her mind. Running and hiding had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with her past. On Friday afternoon, Maria walked into Admiral Harrison's office at the Pentagon. She had requested the meeting to discuss his offer of returning to active service. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "And I want to know more about the possibilities. But I have conditions." Admiral Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression attentive. "I'm listening." "I don't want to hide anymore," Maria said firmly. "If I'm going to return to military service, I want to do work that matters. I want to use my experience and knowledge to make a difference." "What kind of work are you thinking about?" "Training," Maria replied without hesitation. "There are still American Special Operations teams working in South America. There are still corrupt officials and criminal organizations operating in the same ways they were 15 years ago. Someone needs to teach our people how to recognize the signs, how to avoid the traps that caught so many of us back then." Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Your experience gives you insights that can't be learned from textbooks or briefings." "But I won't work undercover, and I won't hide my identity anymore," Maria continued. "If Colonel Mendoza and his friends want to find me, they already have. Pretending to be someone else hasn't protected me, and it's kept me from doing the work I'm actually qualified to do." "There are risks to taking such an open stance," Admiral Harrison warned. "There are risks either way," Maria countered. "At least this way, I'll be doing something meaningful while I face those risks." They spent the next hour discussing specific possibilities. The Military Special Operations Command was developing new training programs for operations in Latin America. There were intelligence analysis positions that would benefit from her first-hand experience with criminal military partnerships. There were also opportunities to work with allied forces from countries throughout the region. "What rank would I hold?" Maria asked. "That depends on which path you choose," Admiral Harrison explained. "If you want to focus on training and analysis, we could commission you as a major or lieutenant colonel, depending on your educational background and experience. If you're interested in more operational roles, there are different possibilities." Maria had completed her bachelor's degree during her years in the United States, taking night classes while working full-time. She had never pursued advanced education, but her practical experience was extensive. "I want to start with training," she decided. "I want to help ensure that the next generation of American soldiers and Marines understands what they're really facing when they deploy to South America." Admiral Harrison smiled. "I think that's an excellent choice. There's a new program starting at Fort Bragg in 6 months. The Special Operations Training Center is developing a curriculum specifically focused on counter-cartel operations and regional threat assessment." "When would I need to decide?" "Soon," Admiral Harrison replied. "The selection process for instructor positions is competitive, and you need to go through abbreviated officer training to prepare for the role." As Maria left the Pentagon that evening, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The prospect of returning to uniform was both exciting and daunting, but it felt right in a way that her civilian life never quite had. Over the weekend, she visited Roberto Vega at his home in Virginia Beach. His house was modest, but comfortable, filled with military memorabilia and photographs from his long career. His wife Rosa prepared a traditional Puerto Rican meal, and they spent the evening sharing stories and catching up on old times. "You're really thinking about going back?" Roberto asked as they sat on his back porch after dinner. "I think I have to," Maria replied. "Running away didn't work. Hiding didn't work. Maybe it's time to stand and fight." "It won't be easy," Roberto warned. "You'll be making yourself a visible target. Mendoza and people like him won't give up just because you're wearing an American uniform. But I'll have resources and support that I don't have as a civilian contractor," Maria pointed out. "And I'll be doing work that actually uses my experience and knowledge." Rosa joined them on the porch with coffee and homemade flan. "Roberto told me what you did in Colombia," she said quietly. "You saved his friends. You saved American soldiers at the risk of your own life." "I did what anyone would have done," Maria replied modestly. "No," Rosa shook her head. "Most people would have saved themselves. You chose to be a hero. Now you have another chance to choose." The words resonated with Maria as she drove home that night. She had spent 15 years trying to be ordinary, trying to blend in and avoid attention. But extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary responses. On Monday morning, Maria walked into Admiral Harrison's office with her decision made. She was ready to return to the life she had left behind in Colombia, but this time on her own terms, and with the full support of the American military behind her. "I want to do this," she told the Admiral. "I want to train the next generation and make sure they don't make the mistakes we made." Admiral Harrison stood and extended his hand. "Welcome back to active duty, Major Santos." For the first time in 15 years, Maria Santos was ready to stop running and start fighting back. 6 months later, Major Maria Santos stood in front of a classroom filled with some of the most elite soldiers in the American military. Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marine Force recon operators, and Air Force pararescue specialists filled the seats, all preparing for deployments to South America. The irony was not lost on her. The woman who had once been handcuffed and suspected of espionage was now training America's finest warriors. The transformation in Maria's life had been remarkable. After accepting Admiral Harrison's offer, she had undergone an intensive 3-month officer training program designed specifically for experienced personnel transitioning into new roles. The physical demands had been challenging after years of civilian life, but her military instincts had returned quickly. More importantly, she had found her purpose again. The Special Operations Training Center had given her complete freedom to develop a curriculum based on her real-world experience. Her classes on understanding criminal-military partnerships in Latin America had become the most sought-after sessions in the entire program. Today we're going to discuss something that isn't in any field manual. Maria began her morning lecture. How to recognize when the people you're supposed to be helping are actually working against you. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed a photograph of a Colombian military base. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other installation, but Maria pointed out subtle details that revealed its true nature. This base was supposedly being used to interdict drug shipments, she explained. But notice the helicopter landing pad. It's positioned to provide concealed access to the main building. The guard towers face inward, not outward. The perimeter fence has gaps that appear to be maintenance issues, but are actually designed for discreet entry and exit. One of the Green Berets raised his hand. "Ma'am, how can you tell the difference between legitimate security measures and deliberate compromises?" It was exactly the kind of question Maria had hoped to hear. These soldiers were thinking like professionals, not just following procedures. "Experience," she replied honestly, "and intuition developed through that experience. But there are patterns you can learn to recognize." She spent the next hour walking through case studies from her time with the Black Eagles, showing how supposedly loyal units had revealed themselves to be compromised. The students took extensive notes, asking detailed questions about operational security and threat assessment. After class, Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Marine Corps approached Maria's desk. She was a sharp intelligence officer with multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. "Major Santos," she said, "I wanted to thank you for this training. I've been briefed on cartel operations before, but nobody ever explained the human elements the way you do." "What do you mean?" "How corruption spreads through personal relationships and family obligations," Captain Walsh explained. The briefings always focused on the organizational structure and money flow, but they never addressed how individual soldiers get pulled into these networks. Maria nodded. This was one of the most important lessons she tried to convey. Corruption rarely starts with someone deciding to become a criminal. It usually begins with someone trying to solve a personal problem or protect their family. She had seen it happen countless times. Good soldiers who made small compromises that led to bigger ones, until they found themselves trapped in criminal enterprises they never intended to join. "That's what makes it so dangerous," Maria continued. "When you're working with local forces, you need to understand their personal pressures and motivations, not just their official duties." Captain Walsh thanked her again and left to prepare for her own afternoon classes. Maria was gathering her materials when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was in Spanish. "We know where you work now. Teaching American soldiers won't protect you forever." Maria stared at the screen, her blood running cold. Despite all the security measures and her return to active duty, Colonel Mendoza's people had found her again. She immediately forwarded the message to Agent Wong and Admiral Harrison, then continued with her day as if nothing had happened. She had learned not to let threats disrupt her work. That afternoon, Maria was scheduled to participate in a practical exercise with a team of Navy SEALs. The scenario involved infiltrating a compound suspected of housing both legitimate military personnel and cartel operatives. The challenge was determining who could be trusted and who posed a threat. The exercise took place at a mock village constructed on the Fort Bragg training grounds. Maria played the role of a local military liaison, someone the SEALs would need to work with but whose loyalties were unclear. Lieutenant Commander David Brooks led the SEAL team. He was a veteran of numerous special operations missions, but this was his first training for South American deployment. "Major Santos," he said as they prepared for the exercise, "how realistic should we expect this scenario to be?" "More realistic than you might like," Maria replied. "The situations you'll face downrange are often much more ambiguous than what we can simulate in training." The exercise began with Maria meeting the SEAL team at a checkpoint outside the village. She was dressed in civilian clothes and carried identification that marked her as a Colombian military intelligence officer. Her job was to guide them to the suspected compound while providing information about local threats. As they moved through the village, Maria began exhibiting behaviors that the SEALs needed to recognize as warning signs. She steered them away from certain routes without adequate explanation. She showed excessive knowledge of the compound's layout for someone who claimed to have limited access. She received text messages that she tried to hide from the team. Lieutenant Commander Brooks picked up on some of the signals, but missed others. When they reached the compound, Maria led them to a door that she claimed was the main entrance, but was actually a trap designed to expose them to crossfire from multiple positions. Exercise terminated. Called out the range safety officer. "SEAL team, you're all dead." During the debrief, Maria walked through all the warning signs the team had missed. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was frustrated but eager to learn. "I caught that you were being evasive about your background," he said, "but I missed the significance of the text messages. In real operations, your local liaison will always be receiving communications," Maria explained. "The question is whether they're sharing relevant information with you. In this case, I received 3 messages that should have alerted you to problems." She showed them the fake messages that had been part of the exercise: warnings about increased cartel activity in the area, information about military units that weren't where they were supposed to be, and intelligence about potential threats to the compound. "Why didn't you share that information with us?" asked one of the SEALs. "Because in the scenario, I was compromised," Maria replied. "I was feeding you false information while keeping you ignorant of real threats. This happens more often than you might think." The exercise was repeated twice more with different scenarios. Each time, the SEAL team performed better at recognizing the warning signs of compromised allies and dangerous situations. After the training ended, Lieutenant Commander Brooks approached Maria privately. "Major, can I ask you something? When you were in Colombia, how did you know who to trust?" Maria considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I didn't always know. I made mistakes that nearly got people killed. But I learned to trust my instincts and to verify everything through multiple sources." "Any specific advice?" "Watch how people interact with each other when they think you're not paying attention," Maria said. "Listen to what they don't tell you as much as what they do. And always have an exit strategy." That evening, Maria returned to her apartment to find Agent Wong waiting in the lobby with a security team. "We need to talk," Wong said without preamble. They went up to Maria's apartment, where Wong showed her intelligence reports that had been intercepted over the past several days. "Colonel Mendoza has been busy," Wong explained. "We've identified at least 4 different attempts to gather information about your current activities and location." "How close have they gotten?" Maria asked. "Closer than we'd like," Wong admitted. One of the attempts came from someone posing as a journalist researching a story about former Colombian military personnel living in the United States. The fake journalist had contacted the Special Operations Training Center, claiming to be working on a human interest story about international cooperation in military training. The inquiry had been properly screened and rejected, but it showed how persistent and creative Mendoza's people were being. "There's something else," Wong continued. "We have intelligence suggesting that Mendoza is planning something more direct than gathering information. She showed Maria photographs of two men who had entered the United States on tourist visas 2 weeks earlier. Both had connections to Colombian paramilitary groups and histories of violence. We're tracking them, but they've been careful to avoid detection, Wong explained. We believe they may be conducting surveillance in preparation for an operation. Maria studied the photographs, trying to memorize the faces. Neither man looked familiar from her time in Colombia, which meant they were probably younger operatives recruited specifically for this mission. What are my options? Maria asked. We can increase your protection detail, Wong offered. We can also arrange for you to be temporarily relocated while we track down these individuals. Relocation means giving up my work here, Maria pointed out. It means letting them win again. Wong nodded reluctantly. That's the trade-off. Safety versus continuing your mission. Maria walked to her window and looked out at the Virginia landscape. Somewhere out there, people who wanted her dead were planning their next move. She could run again, as she had been running for 15 years. Or she could stand and fight. I have a third option, Maria said finally. Which is, we use me as bait. Wong looked alarmed. Major, that's extremely dangerous. These people are professional killers. So am I, Maria replied calmly. And I have advantages they don't expect. She outlined her plan. Instead of hiding from the threat, they would create an opportunity for Mendoza's people to make their move under controlled conditions. Maria would maintain her normal schedule, but in locations where federal agents could provide hidden support. If we can capture these operatives, Maria explained, we might be able to trace their network and identify other threats. Running away just delays the problem. Wong was skeptical, but she agreed to present the plan to her superiors. Within 48 hours, approval came back from the highest levels of the counterintelligence community. The operation was set for the following week, during a field training exercise that would take Maria away from the heavily secured environment of Fort Bragg. She would be conducting realistic training with a special operations team at a remote facility in the North Carolina mountains. On the morning of the operation, Maria put on her Army combat uniform and checked her personal weapons one final time. She had traded her translator's badge for an officer's commission, but she was about to face the same enemies who had driven her from Colombia 15 years earlier. As she drove toward the training site, followed by discreet federal agents, Maria felt a calm determination settle over her. She had spent half her adult life running from the past. Today, she would finally confront it. The training facility was located in a valley surrounded by dense forest. It provided excellent cover for both the legitimate training exercise and the law enforcement operation that would unfold alongside it. Maria arrived at 0800 hours and began setting up her training materials. The special operations team she was working with had no knowledge of the security operation, ensuring their reactions would be natural and believable. At 1030 hours, Agent Wong's voice crackled through Maria's concealed earpiece. Two targets approaching from the north. They're armed and moving with tactical precision. Maria continued teaching as if nothing was happening, but her muscles tensed in preparation for action. 15 years of civilian life hadn't erased her combat instincts. Target 1 is moving to the west side of the facility, Wong reported. Target 2 is approaching the main entrance. The plan was for federal agents to allow the operatives to get close enough to make their intentions clear before moving in for the arrest. Maria needed to appear vulnerable while actually being protected by an invisible net of law enforcement personnel. At 1047 hours, everything went wrong. Target 2 produced a rocket-propelled grenade instead of the expected small arms. The explosive round struck the main building, sending debris flying in all directions and immediately escalating the situation beyond what anyone had anticipated. All units engage. Engage. Agent Wong's voice shouted through the radio as the training exercise turned into a real firefight. Maria dove for cover behind an overturned table, her military training taking over automatically. She could hear the special operations soldiers shouting as they tried to understand what was happening and respond to the unexpected attack. Target 1 burst through the facility's rear entrance, assault rifle in hand, scanning for Maria. When he spotted her, his eyes lit up with recognition and hatred. "Maria Santos," he shouted in accented English. "Colonel Mendoza sends his regards." The operative raised his weapon, but Maria was already moving. 15 years of civilian life evaporated in an instant as she rolled to the side and drew her sidearm in one fluid motion. The shot she fired was instinctive, automatic, perfect. Target 1 dropped to the ground, his weapon clattering across the floor. Outside, the battle between Target 2 and federal agents continued. More explosions shook the building as smoke grenades filled the air. Through the chaos, Maria heard a familiar voice calling her name. Admiral Harrison had arrived with a security detail, having insisted on being present for the operation despite the risks to his own safety. Major Santos. Report, he shouted. 1 target down, Maria replied, moving to secure Target 1's weapon. Target 2 still active outside. The firefight ended abruptly when Target 2 was surrounded and forced to surrender. As the smoke cleared, Maria found herself standing in the ruins of the training facility, covered in dust but unharmed. Agent Wong approached her with an expression of amazement. Major, that was incredible shooting under pressure. I haven't forgotten everything, Maria replied, checking to ensure that Target 1 was properly secured. The captured operative was conscious but wounded. As medics worked to stabilize him, he looked up at Maria with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, he said in Spanish. Others will come. Let them come, Maria replied in the same language. I'm not running anymore. Later that evening, after hours of debriefing and medical evaluation, Maria sat with Admiral Harrison in a secure conference room at Fort Bragg. Colonel Mendoza's network is larger than we thought, the Admiral reported. The interrogation of the 2 operatives has revealed connections throughout South America and into the United States. What happens next? Maria asked. Next, we expand your mission, Admiral Harrison replied. The training program you've developed is more important than ever. We need officers who understand these threats and can recognize them before they become deadly. Maria nodded. The attack had proven that her enemies were still determined to eliminate her, but it had also proven that she was ready to fight back. There's something else, Admiral Harrison continued. The President has authorized a new joint task force to combat cartel military partnerships in Latin America. He's asked me to recommend someone to lead the training and intelligence analysis component. Maria looked at him with surprise. You're offering me the position? I'm offering you the chance to finish what you started in Colombia, Admiral Harrison replied. The chance to use everything you've learned to protect American soldiers and dismantle the networks that threaten both our countries. As Maria considered the offer, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young lieutenant in the Colombian Special Forces to a refugee seeking asylum, from a suspected spy to a vindicated hero, from a woman in hiding to a soldier ready to fight. I accept, she said without hesitation. Admiral Harrison smiled and extended his hand. Welcome to Task Force Black Eagle, Colonel Santos. For the first time since she had left Colombia 15 years earlier, Maria Santos was exactly where she belonged, in uniform, in the fight, and ready to protect the people and the country that had given her a second chance at life. The tattoo on her forearm, which had once been a secret she desperately tried to hide, now represented a promise she was finally ready to fulfill.